I carried a surrogate baby for 9 months, then the parents changed their minds. By the time I started pushing, I had already checked my phone more times than I could count. It was resting beside my hand on the hospital bed, screen facing up, volume turned all the way on. Every vibration in the room made my eyes shift toward it automatically, the monitor adjusting, the fourth pole rolling slightly, footsteps in the hallway outside my door. The nurse told me when to push. I followed her voice, focused on the ceiling tiles, on the pressure building low and heavy. Another contraction came. Then another. The room stayed quiet in the way hospitals get when everyone is doing their job efficiently. No one else was there. Between pushes, my gaze kept drifting to the empty space near the door. I had expected movement. Someone rushing in late. Apologies whispered quickly. A familiar face taking up the chair against the wall. Nothing happened. The epidural dulled the pain but not the awareness. I could feel the work my body was doing, the strain, the effort. I could hear the nurse counting. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear how steady everything sounded, too steady, considering what was missing. When the baby was delivered, there was a brief shift in the room. Sound, activity, then quiet again. They placed the baby on my chest out of routine. Warm, heavier than I expected. My hands hovered for a second before touching anything. I remember thinking, very clearly, that this moment was supposed to belong to someone else. I didn't want children. That wasn't something I wrestled with or arrived at after long reflection. It was just something I knew about myself. I was 24, independent, and focused on building stability. When people talked about having kids someday, I didn't feel anything pull in that direction. I wasn't against the idea in theory, it just didn't belong to me at that point in my life. Because of that, the suggestion didn't sound as strange as it probably should have. Someone I trusted mentioned a couple who had been trying to have a baby for a long time. They'd been through appointments, treatments, waiting. None of it had worked. The way it was described wasn't dramatic, just tired, like people who had spent years hoping for something that never quite arrived. That same person mentioned me, not as a solution, exactly, just as someone who might be open to a conversation. I was healthy, responsible, and I had been clear about not wanting children of my own. The idea wasn't framed emotionally, it was framed practically. I listened. Later that night, I sat on my bed and thought about it more seriously. I thought about my finances, how carefully I managed them, how much effort it took to stay ahead instead of just getting by. I thought about pregnancy as something physical, not symbolic, something my body could do without changing the direction of my life. When the couple reached out, they were polite and measured. We met in person a few days later at a small cafe on the north side of town. They arrived together. The woman's name was Marin. The man was David. They sat close. They spoke calmly, as if they'd already accepted whatever answer I gave. They explained that they couldn't go through a formal surrogacy agency. It was too expensive, too restrictive, too slow. They said they'd been referred to me because I seemed grounded, reliable, someone who wouldn't complicate things. They didn't share many medical details, and I didn't ask for them. It didn't feel like a negotiation or a transaction in the way people imagine. It felt like two parties recognizing something that worked for both of us. They offered me a specific amount of money, $35,000. It wasn't vague or negotiable. It was enough to change my circumstances in a meaningful way, enough to pay off debt, cover living expenses, and give me breathing room for the first time in years. They said they wanted to pay everything up front: rent, medical expenses, groceries, any pregnancy-related costs. They didn't want money to become a source of stress or tension. They said they wanted me focused on staying healthy and stable. I asked what would happen after the baby was born. They answered immediately. They would take the baby home. They already had space prepared. They spoke about how long they had waited for this, how grateful they were, how much they trusted me. At no point did anything feel evasive or rushed. There was no pressure, no urgency. They seemed relieved, if anything, like they'd finally found a solution that made sense. I trusted them. The money arrived within the first week, all of it. I checked my account more than once, just to be sure. The numbers didn't change. I sent them confirmation. They responded with gratitude and reassurance. A month later, I found out I was pregnant. The pregnancy itself was uncomplicated, but not easy. I had morning sickness that lasted well into the day. Some days it lingered until evening. I learned which smells triggered it: coffee, onions, certain cleaning products. I kept crackers in my car and plastic bags in my purse. I learned how to be sick quietly and then continue with my day. They checked in often at first. Marin would text every few days. She asked how I was feeling. They wanted ultrasound photos. When I started feeling movement around week 18, they asked if I could record short videos. I would prop my phone against a pillow and film my stomach rising and shifting under my shirt. I never spoke in those videos. I didn't narrate them or explain what I was feeling. I just sent them. I didn't feel emotionally attached to the pregnancy. That's something I didn't fully recognize until later. At the time, it just felt neutral. The kicks didn't feel symbolic. They felt like reminders that something was progressing as expected. I treated the pregnancy like a responsibility I had agreed to manage carefully. I followed every instruction. I took my vitamins. I went to every appointment. I avoided anything I was told to avoid. I documented expenses and forwarded receipts. They reimbursed everything quickly. Around the second trimester, they invited me to see the nursery. Their house was about an hour away, in a suburb I'd driven through but never stopped in. I drove there on a Saturday morning, my stomach just beginning to show. They greeted me at the door and led me down the hallway. The nursery was already painted, soft gray walls. A crib was assembled near the window. A rocking chair sat in the corner. Boxes of diapers were stacked neatly against the wall. I stood in the doorway while they talked about where everything would go. The room smelled like fresh paint and clean laundry. It didn't make me emotional. It made me feel reassured. People don't prepare like this if they don't intend to follow through. That thought settled something in me. After that visit, communication slowly changed. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to notice. They still responded when I sent updates. They still paid expenses promptly, but they stopped initiating conversations. Messages became shorter, less frequent. Marin's texts went from paragraphs to single sentences. Glad you're feeling better. Thanks for the update. Looks good. I told myself they were busy, or nervous, or trying to give me space. None of those explanations felt unreasonable. People process anticipation differently. I didn't need constant reassurance, and I assumed they were managing their own emotions in their own way. As my due date approached, we discussed delivery briefly. They said they would be there. They said to contact them as soon as labor started. I saved their number at the top of my phone under M+D. When the contractions finally began, it was just past 2 in the morning. I texted them. Labor started, heading to hospital now. There was no response. At first, I assumed they were asleep, or driving, or caught up in something unavoidable. I went to the hospital anyway. I checked in. I filled out paperwork. I put my phone face up beside me and kept glancing at it. Minutes passed. Then more. The contractions were coming regularly now, timed and tracked by the monitor beside my bed. A nurse came in to check my progress. She asked if anyone else was coming. I said yes. She nodded and left the room. I checked my phone again. Nothing. By the time a nurse asked if anyone else was coming, I felt something shift, not emotionally, but structurally. Like a step in a process hadn't happened the way it was supposed to. They were supposed to be here. And for the first time since this arrangement began, I felt the quiet weight of how much of it had depended on trust. I asked if the baby could be placed in the bassinet. No one questioned it. The nurses assumed what they needed to assume. They moved efficiently, respectfully. The room returned to its previous order, machines humming, paperwork being updated, voices lowering again. The chairs by the window stayed empty. I stayed in the hospital for 2 days. During that time, they never reached out. Not during labor, not after delivery, not later that night, not the next morning. I sent messages that shifted in tone as the hours passed. First informative, then checking in, then direct. Baby was born at 6:47 a.m. healthy. Everything went well. Are you on your way? Please let me know when you'll be here. I tried calling. Each call went to voicemail. I didn't leave messages. I wasn't ready to hear how my voice would sound asking where they were. I was scared, but I tried not to show it. I smiled when nurses came in. I answered questions clearly. I signed forms. Inside, my thoughts were moving quickly, circling the same problem without finding a way through it. This wasn't part of the plan. Sometime during the afternoon of the first day, while the baby slept in the bassinet beside my bed, I opened my phone and searched their names on Facebook. The post was from that same day. A joint announcement, carefully written, public, polite. They talked about separating, about infertility, about needing time to process a difficult chapter. The timestamp showed it had been posted while I was in labor. They never told me. They never explained. They never reached out. Reading it reframed everything that had come before. The shorter messages, the distance, the lack of excitement. I realized they may have been unraveling long before delivery, that the pregnancy may have stopped feeling hopeful once their marriage began to fail. It didn't excuse the silence, but it explained why it had crept in so gradually. I thought about driving to their house once I was discharged. The idea stayed with me longer than I expected. I imagined pulling into their driveway, standing there with a baby they hadn't come for, knocking on the door, asking them to explain. Then I thought about how that would look, how invasive it would feel, how unplanned everything already was. I didn't even know if they still lived together. The Facebook post mentioned taking space. That could mean anything. I stayed where I was. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in the hospital bed with my phone in my hand, watching the screen dim and light back up again. At some point, I stopped waiting for a message that might change things. I opened Amazon. I added items quietly: a crib, a mattress, sheets, bottles, formula, diapers, wipes, a mobile, a thermometer. Not because I had decided anything, but just in case. Just enough to make sure I wasn't completely unprepared if morning came and nothing had changed. I placed the order with overnight delivery. It wasn't acceptance. It was contingency. By the second day, nurses began talking about discharge. They asked practical questions: feeding, follow-up appointments, transportation. I answered carefully, aware of how unprepared I was. I didn't have a crib. That thought landed hard, not emotionally, but logistically. No place for the baby to sleep, no diapers, no formula, no car seat installed. I hadn't prepared for any of this because I was never supposed to. I wasn't supposed to be taking a baby home. And yet, when I was discharged, that's exactly what happened. One nurse asked if someone was meeting me. I said my family would be flying in soon. She nodded and asked about the car seat. I told her it was at home, that everything had happened quickly, that labor had started abruptly and I hadn't thought to bring it with me. I said it calmly. I didn't want to seem incapable. I wasn't incapable. I was unprepared. The hospital had donated car seats available. They brought one out and helped me secure the baby properly. They explained the straps, checked the angles, asked me to repeat the instructions back to them. I listened closely. I answered clearly. No one questioned me further. By the time we walked toward the exit, my phone showed delivery confirmations. The boxes would arrive before I did. I carried the baby out of the hospital myself. The automatic doors slid open. The air outside was cool and dry. The parking lot stretched out under pale morning light. I walked slowly, adjusting the weight in my arms. The baby was wrapped tightly in a hospital blanket, eyes closed, breathing steady. The drive home was quiet. I drove slower than usual. Every stoplight felt longer than it needed to be. The baby slept the entire way, chest rising and falling steadily in the mirror I'd angled to see the backseat. When I opened the door to my apartment, the space felt wrong immediately. Too empty, too unchanged. The boxes were already there, stacked neatly by the door, labels facing out, crib, bottles, diapers. I stood there for a moment with my keys still in my hand. I assembled the crib carefully, following the instructions step by step. I didn't rush. I wanted it done correctly. The baby lay on a blanket on the floor nearby, still sleeping. By the time I finished, the room looked different, not complete, but altered enough to acknowledge what had happened. That night, I slept in short stretches on the couch near the crib. I kept the lights low. Every sound felt amplified: the hum of the refrigerator, the air turning on, the baby's breathing across the room. I checked my phone once more before closing my eyes. There was still nothing from them. By morning, I understood something clearly. They weren't coming. And whatever happened next would be something I had to decide, not as part of an agreement, but alone. I didn't make the decision all at once. There wasn't a moment where I sat down and declared anything out loud. No announcement, no ceremony. It happened gradually, in the way most irreversible choices do, through small refusals to do the opposite. In the days after I came home, people asked careful questions. Friends, family, nurses at follow-up appointments. They asked how I was doing. They asked what support I had. Some of them asked, gently, what my plan was. I didn't have an answer that fit into a sentence. I thought about agencies. I researched quietly, late at night, phone dimmed low. I read about timelines, processes, requirements. I imagined handing the baby over to people who had prepared for this in a way I hadn't. People with nurseries already finished, with names already chosen. Every time I tried to picture it clearly, something stopped me. It wasn't fear. And it wasn't attachment in the way people expect attachment to look. It was responsibility, slow, heavy, and difficult to explain. I had carried this pregnancy to term. I had been the only constant when everything else had quietly fallen apart. Handing the baby off quickly, just to restore order, felt careless. I wasn't judging anyone who could make that choice. I just knew I couldn't do it yet. There was also guilt, not loud or dramatic, but persistent. The kind that sits in the background and colors every thought. I felt guilty that I hadn't seen this coming. Guilty that I hadn't demanded more structure, more protection. Guilty that the baby was now part of a situation I hadn't intended to create. And underneath that, there was another, quieter feeling. The baby hadn't chosen any of this. The days settled into a routine I hadn't practiced for. Feeding, changing, doctor appointments, paperwork. I learned how to hold someone properly through repetition, how to move without waking them, how to listen for small sounds in the night and know what they meant. I was tired in a way I hadn't experienced before, not just physically, but mentally. Every decision felt consequential. Every mistake felt permanent. I second-guessed myself constantly, then corrected course when I needed to. I didn't feel like I was doing this well. I felt like I was doing it carefully. There were moments when the weight of it pressed down unexpectedly. Standing in a grocery store aisle, staring at shelves I'd never paid attention to before, formula brands I'd never compared, bottle sizes I didn't know existed, filling out forms where my name appeared in places I hadn't planned for it to be. Realizing that my schedule, my priorities, my sense of time had shifted without asking my permission. I thought about the couple occasionally, not with anger, not even with much emotion at all, mostly with a kind of distant clarity. I understood now that their silence wasn't a single decision, but the end result of many smaller ones. Their marriage had been breaking. The pregnancy had stopped feeling like a promise and started feeling like pressure. They had chosen not to face it. I had been left to. There were days I wondered if they would eventually reach out, if an apology would come later. Once the dust settled, I stopped waiting for that fairly quickly. Silence, once established, has a way of explaining itself. 3 weeks after the birth, I received a text from an unknown number. It was Marin. "I'm sorry. I know this doesn't help, but I needed you to know that we didn't plan for this to happen. Things fell apart and I couldn't face it. I hope you and the baby are okay." I read it twice. Then I set my phone down. I didn't respond, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already happened. An apology doesn't undo absence. It doesn't restore structure. It doesn't make the baby less real or the situation less permanent. I deleted the message the next morning. What surprised me most was not the difficulty. It was the steadiness. Even on days when I felt unprepared, even when I questioned myself, there was a sense of order returning, slowly, imperfectly. I learned which tasks needed immediate attention and which could wait. I learned how to ask for help without over-explaining. I learned that capability doesn't always look like confidence. Sometimes it looks like showing up again the next morning. I didn't reframe this experience into something inspirational. I didn't tell myself it happened for a reason. That kind of language didn't fit. What fit was simpler. This happened. I responded. And now I am here. A month passed. Then too. The apartment began to feel different. The crib no longer looked temporary. The baby's clothes filled drawers I'd emptied to make space. Routines became automatic. Feeding times, sleep patterns, the rhythm of small adjustments throughout the day. I started keeping a notebook by the couch. I wrote down milestones. First smile, first time sleeping through the night. Small things that felt worth remembering, even if I didn't know why yet. One afternoon, I sat on the floor with the baby lying on a blanket beside me. Sunlight came through the window at an angle, warm and soft. The baby's hand opened and closed around my finger. I watched that motion repeat, slow and deliberate. I thought about the couple again, about how they had wanted this, how long they had waited, how it had slipped away from them in ways they probably hadn't anticipated either. I didn't feel sorry for them, but I understood that grief and failure don't always arrive the way people expect. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the form of things left undone. I thought about what I would tell the baby someday, not the full story, not all at once, but something true, something that acknowledged the beginning without making it the defining fact. You were wanted, just not by the people who planned for you, and when they couldn't follow through, I did. That felt accurate. Around the 3rd month, I scheduled a consultation with a family lawyer. I needed to understand what my legal position was, whether the couple had any claim, whether the money I'd received created obligations I hadn't considered, whether I needed to formalize anything to protect what had quietly become my reality. The lawyer's office was downtown, in a building with fluorescent lighting and worn carpet. I brought all the documentation I had: texts, receipts, the original agreement we'd discussed over coffee but never signed. The lawyer reviewed everything carefully. She asked questions. She took notes. She explained things in language I could follow. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. There was no enforceable contract. The upfront payment legally resembled a gift, not a custody transfer. Without a formal surrogacy agreement filed through proper channels, the couple had no parental claim. I was listed on the birth certificate. I had been present at delivery. I had taken the baby home. Legally, the baby was mine. She explained it calmly, as if this were a straightforward conclusion. But I felt something shift when she said it. Not relief, exactly. More like recognition. I asked what would happen if they changed their minds. She said they could try to pursue custody, but it would be difficult. They had abandoned their claim through inaction. The separation weakened their position further. The lack of formal agreement meant there was no documented intent to transfer parental rights. She said I should be prepared for the possibility, but that it was unlikely. I left the office with copies of everything she'd reviewed. I walked back to my car slowly, the folder tucked under my arm. The sun was setting. The sky had turned pale orange near the horizon. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. I thought about how much of this had been built on trust, how easily that trust had dissolved, how I had been left holding something no one had prepared me for. But I also thought about how I had responded. I hadn't collapsed. I hadn't abandoned the situation out of fear or frustration. I had adapted, learned, made space for something I hadn't planned. That mattered. By the time I got home, the baby was awake. I picked them up carefully, adjusting their weight against my shoulder. The apartment was warm. The light from the lamp in the corner made everything look softer than it was. I stood there for a moment, just holding them. Not because it felt natural, but because it had become routine. There are still things I don't know. I don't know what the future will look like in detail. I don't know how long it will take to feel fully settled. I don't know which version of myself I'll recognize a year from now. What I do know is that I didn't walk away from something simply because it arrived in a form I hadn't planned for. That matters to me. 6 months have passed since the delivery room. The baby is sleeping through most nights now. The crib is no longer an unfamiliar object in the corner. The routines I built out of necessity have become automatic. I don't think about each step anymore. I just move through them. I deleted Marin and David's contact information a few weeks ago. I didn't do it out of anger. I did it because holding on to it felt like waiting for something that wasn't coming. The silence had become its own answer. I kept the original text thread printed out in a folder, along with the legal consultation notes and the receipts. Not because I wanted to remember, but because documentation felt important. Evidence of what had happened. Proof that this wasn't something I imagined or exaggerated. Some days, I think about the life I had planned before this. The apartment I was going to move into. The job I was going to take. The savings I was going to build. All of that still exists in some version of the future, just delayed, adjusted, made different by the presence of someone who wasn't supposed to be here. I don't resent that. I'm not grateful for it either. It's just what is. One morning, I stood by the window with the baby in my arms. The light was coming through at a low angle, the kind that makes dust visible in the air. The baby's eyes were open, unfocused but aware. Their hand reached toward the glass, fingers spreading and closing. I thought about trust again, how much I had given, how easily it had been broken, how I would probably be more careful in the future, more cautious about arrangements built on good faith instead of structure. But I also thought about how trust had brought me here, to this moment, to this responsibility I hadn't asked for but had chosen not to abandon. That choice felt like something I could stand behind. I still don't know if I want children in the way other people describe wanting them, but I know that I have one. And I know that I'm not walking away. The baby made a small sound, something between a sigh and a hum. I adjusted my hold, shifting their weight slightly. The morning stretched out ahead of us, ordinary and quiet. There was laundry to fold, bottles to wash, an appointment scheduled for later in the week, small tasks that had become the architecture of my days. I stepped away from the window and set the baby down in the play mat on the floor. They looked up at me, eyes tracking my movement. I sat down beside them, close enough to reach if they needed me. The apartment was warm. The light was soft. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. This wasn't the life I planned, but it is the one I chose not to abandon.